everybody, and welcome to today's video. With the release of Nioh and its sequel on PlayStation 5 last week, I thought that now would be a good excuse to look at a topic that I've had mulling around in my head for quite a while, as it explains a lot, I think, about why I generally prefer JRPGs to their Western equivalents. It's not that I don't like Western RPGs, but I do prefer JRPGs, and I think one of the core reasons for that is the concept of Huakki Yagyo. Now, Huakki Yagyo translates best to Night Parade of 100 Demons, and the idea behind it is literal to that name. The observer, being the audience or the reader or the person that's looking at the artwork or playing the game, sees an seemingly endless parade of yokai and oni broken free of the spirit world and hoarding through the realm of humanity. It is a concept that dates back well over 1,000 years in terms of storytelling tradition, and it's also been visualized for a very long time as well, with the oldest surviving artwork that we have depicting the parade from the 16th century. It was a hand scroll from the 16th century. That was the first example that we still have that depicts it in a visual format. The storytelling tradition is ancient, in other words, and very much integral to the Japanese storytelling tradition. We see this play out in JRPGs, whether they're dark like Nioh, or something that is more aesthetically bright and happy, like Dragon Quest or Final Fantasy. When you look at one of the classical visualizations of Huakki Yagyo, in other words, when you look at one of the hand scrolls, you are going to notice something stand out, and that is that the yokai and oni are intensely varied in design, and the 100 demons that the scroll depicts very much looks like the bestiary of a JRPG. This is not coincidental, and to understand why, you first need to consider Japanese spirituality. So, Japan has two principal religions, which I think most people would be aware of at this point. One is Buddhism, which it imported from China relatively recently, and the other is its own native religion, Shinto, which remains very much relevant today despite being a part of the Japanese culture for as long as there has been a Japanese culture. Shinto is an animistic religion in that it attributes a soul to every object, whether that object be a human or other animal, plant, or inanimate object. And so, when Shinto attempts to explain the unexplained, which is a core function of any religion, of course, it has, over the process of thousands of years, created a massively vibrant range of ways to visualize that event. That's why, when it comes time for an artist to collect all the yokai that have been described over that period of time into the one resource, such as a hand scroll or video game, we end up with this massive variety of monsters that are incredibly rich in terms of their variety aesthetically and stylistically. We could have a game that would have umbrellas that have a single eye that hop around, which is an actual yokai that is called the Kasa Obake. They could also have frog-like men with razor-sharp claws, which would be Kappa, and then you'd also come across a monstrously big skeleton called Gasha Dokuro. All of that could happen within the one game, and they'd all be yokai. The last one is particularly interesting because it shows that yokai and their role in Japanese culture remain in a constant state of evolution and flux. Gasha Dokuro only actually came into being in the later half of the 20th century, and it was a creation in response to the warfare, famine, and other tragedies that were affecting a fairly starving, terrified population at the time. So, with all of that as an introduction, just before COVID hit, I went along to the Art Gallery of New South Wales because they had a special exhibition going on that was looking at Japanese spirituality and monsters in the arts. And, as I always do, I picked up the exhibition book, and in that, there's an essay on yokai. In that essay, the writer notes that Japan's yokai culture is extraordinarily rich. Yokai, legend, and folklore are brimming with a profusion of yokai types, and their representations also abound. Characteristic of Japan's yokai culture is the great range of individual yokai types. This is due to the naming of mysterious phenomena at a local level. For example, a strange sound similar to the beating of a tatami mat might be called a tatami wrapper, while unexplained sounds similar to the washing of small beans were called azuki bean washers. Such naming took place throughout the country and served to identify the innumerable kinds of yokai. Artistic imagination also gave shape to folkloric phenomena. Mysterious phenomena now took on tangible or physical forms. When one felt embarrassed, for example, the feeling was attributed to a certain kind of yokai embarrasser. That's the end of the passage that I'll read. Incidentally, that was a really good exhibition that I went to then, and while it's not on anymore, even if you were in Australia or could go to the New South Wales Gallery, if you ever do get a chance to look at some of these hand scrolls or other interpretations of Huakki Yagyo in person, I highly recommend it. Looking up images online just doesn't have the same impact as seeing such a sustained effort at creativity stretched across an entire scroll. You just have to see the whole thing in person to really be mesmerized about how vibrant and creative it is. To get back to the topic of RPGs and Japanese games, we don't really have an equivalent to Huakki Yagyo in the West, and I do think that affects how game developers look at their work. The closest approximation from European folklore might be the Wild Hunt, which was a real thing, not just a subtitle for a Witcher video game, and there are some similarities there in that it's depicting a large-scale invasion of the spirit world into the real world. But in the case of the Wild Hunt, the form of the individual spirits isn't the focus, as it is with Huakki Yagyo. Meanwhile, the religions of the various parts of the world have had a different impact as well. So the three religions of the book, being Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, characterize monstrosity as a more kind of universal horror, and it's a group. So, for example, the various trips through hell, if you read Dante's Inferno as one example, they depict archetypes of the various deadly sins rather than a parade of individual monsters based on creative interpretations of sounds, emotions, and natural forces. There's the uniformity to the kind of monstrosity that these religions present, whereas with Shinto, because every individual object has its own individual soul, there's a great deal more individuality in terms of what a monster might look like. And so, when developers sit down to create their games, there is generally, not always, but usually, a greater variety in the monsters that you will find and fight in a JRPG. And I do mean variety both in terms of the total number of different enemies that you'll fight and the design of those enemies. You'll get some wildly different designs in a JRPG, whereas with a Western RPG there is a more universality about the monsters and the way that they look. So the nature of yokai as being inherently something natural and native to the world means that a JRPG with a relatively serious narrative, something like the Final Fantasy series for example, can still have Moogles fluttering around. Western RPGs, even for those that take place in utterly fantastic settings, such as Mass Effect or Dragon Age, are very much more focused on creating the perception of believability and consistency, where Japanese game creators find their center in the unreal. There's also the length of time of the culture to consider here as well. The reality is that most Western RPGs are conceived and created in countries like America or Canada, which haven't been around for long in this current form, and unfortunately the developers don't tend to engage with their native peoples for the RPG stories, because they absolutely should. That would be amazing, but they don't. Or alternatively, the Western RPGs come out of Europe, which has had a very different form of cultural development over the years, because there's been so much movement of nations and peoples. Japan is one of the longest continuous nations and cultures, and that relative cultural stability has meant that the people have developed this inherent depth of storytelling traditions and so much material to draw on, and therefore the range of their stories to draw on are extensive, and they've just got so many more characters, the yokai being a really good example of that. All those yokai come from somewhere, and they're just remembered over history, and they're just built on, so that you just have this, I'm going to use a word I hate, but you just have all this content from centuries and thousands of years indeed to draw on when you're creating your own games. And so, like I said at the start of the video, I do prefer JRPGs to Western RPGs. It's not that I don't like Western RPGs, because I do like them a great deal, and some of my favourite games are Western RPGs, But as an overall genre, I prefer the JRPG because it just has that depth of cultural experience, which the Japanese don't really think about. Not to any great depth while they're creating these things. They just want to put yokai in the games or whatever. But the learnings of the culture are inherent in every video game that they make, so that when I sit down to play something like Nioh, I am effectively playing something that has been built up over thousands and thousands of years, and it's just not something you can learn. You know, sitting here in the West, and I come from Australia, which is another one of those countries that in its current form hasn't had that much history. I can go and research as much as I want about Japanese history, but I couldn't create a game that is inherently like Nioh because I don't have that kind of built-in cultural background that occurs when you live in a country from your birth. Anyhow, that is enough for this video. I will have a brief review of the Nioh remasters up on digitallydownloaded.net as well today, to go with the reviews I did of the games when they were first released back on the PlayStation 4. But what I will say in this video is that aside from some enhancements to the base game, it is basically the same thing, which is excellent. They're both 5-star games effortlessly, and I highly recommend them. Let me know your own thoughts in the comments about Yokai, Hyakki Yagyo, or anything else with relation to this video. Let me know what you think of Nioh too. Let's talk about Nioh while we're here. But yeah, if you do enjoy my videos, please do click that like and subscribe button. That way you won't miss any. And also, please consider backing me on Patreon, because you can do so for just $1 a month, and even that $1 a month will go a long way to helping me to grow this channel further. And it's nice to have the vote of confidence from the audience as well. So I certainly appreciate every bit of support that you can throw my way. Anyway, thanks as always for your support and watching these videos. I hope this was interesting, and we will see you at the next one.